Buongiorno mondo, and welcome back to 15 with Fosca, the podcast. I am delighted to have with me here today Mark Scott. Hi, Mark.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine. And Mark has been my intern this spring semester here in Florence. He is a journalism student at the University of Missouri, where he'll be returning this fall to do his final year. And I have been very appreciative of your help, Mark. And the idea to do this special podcast where we answer listeners' questions was actually your idea. And so I thought it would be a fun final project for Mark if he actually asked me the questions that were submitted to me so that I can answer them live here on the podcast. So without further ado, I think, Mark, we should just dive in and let's start with the questions, and I'll try to answer them as best as I can.
Sounds like a plan. So thank you guys for writing in. I think this is a really good way to get, listener engagement, which is always great. So dive right in. The first question we got is, generally, do Italians view their pace and lifestyle as slow or just right?
That's a good question. I think a lot of it depends on where you live in Italy, because you've lived in Florence now for a while, and I think you've observed that Florentines look like they're in a rush most of the time. And I think with any major Italian city, you're going to see that. I have to say, obviously, if you live in a smaller town, if you live, and whether that be north or south, I think it's just a slower paced life. I think most Italians would say nowadays, at least most Italians, I know that they're having a hard time with time, just like many of us in the world are. So something that I think is that the life here is not as slow as people tend to think, but there are things that enable you to have a slower life. For example, you have more paid vacation time. There are certain things that are sort of built into the culture that sort of force you to slow down. But I don't think it's like a daily thing necessarily, unfortunately, anymore. But you can slow down in the summer, or you can, take time. If there's, for example, there were just 2 big holidays here. And so if you can find a way to strategically take your vacations, you could have actually taken a week or more off without missing too much work. So I think most Italians today would say that the pace has gotten a little too fast. But I still think comparatively, it's still a bit slower than it is in the United States.
I was going to say, that's very interesting to hear that it was even slower in the past, because when I compare my experience here to just viewing how Italians live on a daily basis, it's just night and day, I feel.
What feels slow to you?
I just feel that I'm just so used to in America where everybody is, you're working 40 hours a week, everything is so set in stone in America, where here it's, you go to a store, and they do have hours on the glass, but those hours don't really, they kind of open and close as they go, which is kind of cool. I feel like America is so work driven, and so like I said, it's just night and day. It's refreshing, I would say, for sure.
Yeah, and I think those kinds of realities, thank God those still exist, but the mom and pop shops and things like that, you do still see that kind of slowed down rhythm. But for example, the major supermarkets or any kind of chain, they were all open, for example, on May 1st, which is Labor Day.
Right.
And that's controversial every year.
Okay.
And so I think as Americans, we're oh, it's a holiday, but everything's still open.
Right.
So here, that's changed. If I think about when I first moved here, we're talking about a long time ago, but sort of, I think also it would be impossible for the extreme velocity with which the world and news travels for Italians not also to be affected by that. So I do think, yes, I see your point, but also sort of also being in the thick of it. I think a lot of it also depends on your reality here.
Right.
So, for example, when I was working for Stanford, that was a U.S. rhythm if you're working for a multinational company. So if you're working in a city like Milan,
Right.
So I guess a lot of it really does depend on where you are and what you do.
Interesting. Okay, move on to the second one.
Yeah, ready?
So the second question is, do Italians ever get tired of the traditional trattoria style of cuisine?
That's a great question because, I guess it depends on who you are because there are some people I know who would probably not happily experiment other cuisines.
Right.
But when I first moved to Florence, and this is something I talk about with my friends who've been here for a long time, and they remember that there were slim pickings. Like it was really hard to find something that was not traditional Tuscan or traditional Italian. And so the only options you had for something different were like, maybe there were a couple of Chinese restaurants. There have been a couple of Indian restaurants that have been around for a long time. But if I look at the landscape now and I see how many options there are, and I see when I go out, for example, because as an American, I get sick of trattorias every night, as you know, as you can imagine. And so the old days, it was really hard to find some kind of like an international offer, if you will. And now there are so many really good options. And I think Italians, especially Florentines, really like that about this city. It's very cosmopolitan. So I think it's something that has really made locals happy as well.
Good.
Having those options to say, like, you know what, tonight I want to try, for example, there's a whole street in Florence that has Peruvian restaurants. And that didn't exist when I had first gotten here. Now you can get Pan-Asian food or Asian fusion. You can get pretty much any kind of food you want. And now, kebabs, which I know you love, all students love.
Kebabs.
I know you do. And so does Luca. And he knows, like, he has mapped out every kebab place in Florence. But like when I had first gotten here, maybe there were one or two places.
Really?
Yeah.
I feel like you can't go down the street and not see one anywhere.
Right. And I think locals appreciate that too, because I think people do, it's not that they get sick of, the trattoria, because the food here is so good no matter what.
Right, yeah.
But I do think it's nice to change it up. And the world has become so global that it would sort of be a shame not to take advantage of that. Florence is a really nice international dining scene now. They've really upped the bar, which is nice for long-term residents like me who are from all over the world, but I think also for like tried and true Florentines to have places that they can go to where they can have a diverse, offering, if you will.
Yeah, I totally agree. I feel like there's a lot of options. I know we think that if there was just a killer Mexican spot.
That's missing.
I think that would make so much money here.
I think so too. Well. I think so too. So I'm actively thinking about, I'm talking about it with people. I've proposed it. So I'm putting it out there. If anyone, there's definitely, it's missing here, a really good Mexican place. And I think people would very much appreciate it. You can get a decent margarita, but.
I will say I had a pretty good one at
Tijuana. Yeah. Tijuana. You can get a decent margarita, thank goodness, but it'd be nice also if we could up that ante as well. So whoever is out there listening, we could use a really good Mexican place here in Florence. Thank you in advance.
Okay, so moving on to the third question. I was wondering this myself, actually, before I say this. At what point of the year or temperature do the puffer coats go back in the closet?
I don't know. I think Italians always keep them at the ready.
I'm walking around in a t-shirt when it's 60 degrees and I'm living life, and then they look at me like I'm a crazy person. It's crazy.
Exactly. Well, okay, to be fair, it's been a very unpredictable spring.
Fair, yeah.
However, Italians don't like to. Okay, so the former president of Stanford University once said something that really resonated, and I've always, till this day, I always say it. And he said, Italians dress according to the season, not to the temperature or to the weather.
Okay.
So, for example, even if it's 90 degrees, but it's September, you got to have something on. You got to have your puffer, at least a scarf.
A puffer in 90 degrees?
A light puffer,
God.
Because it's September.
Right.
And now, even though it's May, and so it's funny because I guess like a week ago, I was walking on a Saturday in downtown Florence, and I just stopped and I watched people walk by, and I tried to guess the nationality. And you saw Americans, Northern Europeans, they all were ready for the beach. It was probably about 30 degrees centigrade. It was not by any means cold. It was not hot, but it was, pretty warm. So I saw a lot of sandals, saw a lot of Birkenstocks, saw some flip-flops, saw shorts, t-shirts, tank tops, you name it. And then I saw the Italians.
Yeah.
Potentially some French people as well, Spaniards maybe. So wearing always, there's got to be the layers because of the temperature extremes. And one of the things that you have to know about Italians is that they're obsessed with temperature extremes. And they're obsessed with something called the spifero, which is a draft. And they believe that there is a draft that could potentially cause immense damage. It could either give you a massive headache. You could it could give you a stiff neck. Worst case scenario, it can block your digestion. So any kind of temperature extreme is just not good for your body.
Right.
So Italians tend to be more formal, as you've noticed, in the way they dress, but also they just wear more clothing.
Right.
Right? And you mentioned the puffer jacket, but do we want to talk about hats? I might have seen a couple of wool hats on the street today.
Yeah.
And even though it's May, it's a little chilly.
Right.
But it's not wool hat weather.
Correct, yeah.
Right? So Italians have a very special relationship with their clothing and with their outerwear
Right.
and with the seasons. And so as I said, yes, it's May, so it's spring. Hypothetically, we should be dressing a little less, but Italians are still going to have those layers. And they're wearing the lighter puffer jacket. I think the average Italian probably has 3 or 4 different
Right.
weights or something. So you have the super light one, the medium one, and then the freezing cold, when you go skiing or to the mountains one. So yeah, I don't think I think they keep them sort of at the ready.
Yeah. Okay.
But it's good that you've noticed that.
Yeah. Yeah, it was very interesting to me, but that makes a lot of sense. That's definitely
It's a cultural thing.
Yeah.
Italians like to be warm.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Question 4. So in the perspective of an Italian, how do they view tourists? I was actually very interested in this one. Is it beneficial to their economy or is it a nuisance?
It's so beneficial to the economy that even if it's a nuisance, it can't be.
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that makes sense.
I think Italy has always been a country, obviously, that has drawn tourists. This is through the ages, nothing new here. But in this post-pandemic reality, especially in a city like Florence, I think Florence realized it's hard to explain what things looked like then, Mark. It was really, really strange because you have to imagine Florence is a city that belongs, Florence, there are real people who live here. It's not Disneyland. Yet I want you to imagine in those first moments of the pandemic and lockdown, places like Piazza Duomo,
Right.
the whole train station area, Santa Croce, all those areas just empty.
Right.
Especially, the really touristy areas like by the Uffizi, by Piazza della Signoria. And that was a really big wake-up call for the city because all of us, but neighborhoods like mine, were not normal, but you would see people because you'd have to go out to get your basic necessities, right? So pharmacies were open, supermarkets, not clothing stores, hairdressers, things like that. So in my neighborhood, you saw people. But when you went to the downtown area, all of a sudden it was like a ghost town. And so people started asking questions like, where are the people who live here? So when a city depends so heavily upon tourism, like Florence, and something happens like it did during the pandemic, the city also, I think, started to look at ways that it could bill itself in a different way as well. So yes, we still want to be attractive to tourists.
Sure.
We need to be attractive to tourists because it's so much money. Mark, I don't have the numbers, but it's so much money. And they really felt that when the pandemic forced people to stay home. Florence really felt that. So I think the average Italian will say, okay, yes, so life is rough, during high season. But, you deal with it the same way New Yorkers deal with it,
Sure.
the same way Parisians deal with it. I think in Florence you feel a little more because it's such a small town,
Right.
but there are ways around it. And so I think that people who live here in quote unquote sort of more Florentine neighborhoods, sort of where we are now,
Right.
recording out by the university, closer to the airport, where it's really much more residential.
Sure.
A lot of locals live here, mostly locals, I would hazard to say, whereas the downtown is mostly it's become Airbnbs. You have, short-term rentals, you have people staying in hotels. So Florentines maybe complain about the tourists, but they know it's their bread and butter. And so they really can't complain. And I don't think that I think Italians are very proud, and they should be.
Yeah.
I think that, the country has shown itself to be incredibly hospitable.
Yeah, I'd say.
In the post-pandemic, there's a major crisis going on here in terms of the hospitality industry. People are short-staffed, yet somehow, as Italians always do, they're miraculously pulling things off, right? So there's expected to be another major season this summer. We're looking at big numbers again for summer 2024, and we'll see what the rest of the season brings. But no, I don't think Italians look at it as a nuisance. I think they're actually really proud, and I think sometimes Italians tend to not appreciate how much they have. And tourists sometimes showing you that makes you have a greater appreciation, I think, for your country. When somebody comes and says to you, wow, how lucky you are to live in such a beautiful place, or to be surrounded by so much beautiful art, or even to be able to eat so much good gelato. I mean, let's be honest. So I think Italians are very proud. And as I said, it's a huge part of the economy. Huge.
Yeah. Yeah. So moving on to question 5. If family is one of the most important aspects of Italian culture, is it hard for Italians to leave home and go out on their own, or is it a better option to stay close to their family?
This is a really interesting question, and it's actually a problem because a lot of young Italians, especially now, so we were just talking about tourism, something that the tourism industry, not only the tourism industry, but also international students, just in general, there's a major housing crisis here in Florence. There's a major housing crisis all over Italy right now, but I just read some extremely disturbing articles that have been in the newspapers just in the past couple of days about how families are really struggling to be able to find places to rent. Okay,
It's a shame.
Yeah, it's terrible. So imagine a young person in Italy today. Okay, so it's so different from the United States. Yes, people do leave to go to university. Typically, if they do go, they go somewhere. For example, Florence has an excellent public university, but somebody in Florence might decide to go study something in Rome because, let's say, they have a more reputable,
Sure.
department or whatever. So people do move, but they move less than we do, for example, in the United States, and universities also cost a lot less money. So let's look at the average young person, someone your age.
Sure.
What are their prospects upon graduation, their work prospects? They're not very good. They're not very good. You're in a market where, for example, it's impossible to find a house. It's like impossible to rent a house right now. The salaries are extremely low. And so young people are forced to stay at home. It's really hard. Even if a young person were hypothetically to, some young people, of course, live with friends or live with a boyfriend or a girlfriend or whatever, so you're splitting costs. Maybe there are 3 or 4 of you in a shared apartment. It's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard unless you have a lot of help from your family. You have a very, you're able to work and study simultaneously, which is not easy here. And also, as I said, the salaries are low. So in the end, it's not always necessarily even like you might not even be making ends meet that way. So I think Italians are very forced to stay in the family unit until much later. And that becomes both a safety net, but also it can become a hindrance in a way, because if you don't have to go out there and sort of fight for things, then,
Right.
it becomes a little easier. A lot of young Italians are still leaving Italy, and that worries me.
Now, where are they going?
everywhere.
Okay.
The US, especially, I mean, it's called the brain drain. It's infamous. It's been happening for years. But the fact that young people are still leaving is worrisome to me because these are people who should be, the country should be fighting to keep them here,
Sure.
okay?
Right.
So you have, let's say, the creme de la creme, you know, the smartest kids, and what they're doing is they're going to do graduate work, let's say, in Germany or anywhere else in Europe or even undergraduate, if they can, because there are more dynamic markets.
Right.
There are more dynamic labor markets. They're more dynamic, you know, in general. They're just more dynamic economies. And so somebody might even, you know, leave Italy, and this is across the board, regardless of education, because I think about, for example, how many people who work in the hospitality industry leave Italy
Right.
to go. Luca was just telling me about someone he knows who's working in Denmark as a cook, is working half the amount of hours, less than half the amount of hours than a cook here would work,
Right.
and making like almost 3 times the amount of money.
Wow.
So if you have that kind of option, you're going to leave.
Mm-hmm.
I think inevitably most Italians want to come back, like most people
Right.
who leave their countries do. But there are a lot of young people who still do have to leave. And I think that is very hard because Italy is still such a family-centered culture. And the family is always there to help you. But, you know, but that's changing as well. You know, the society is changing. The
Sure.
traditional family hasn't existed for a while, whatever that means, you know. But the family here is still viewed as no matter what, they're there and they'll always be there.
It's great.
And that's it. That's like growing up, you know, when you're young, knowing that you have that safety net is a nice thing. And it's
Yeah.
hard to leave.
Yeah.
But it's also hard to leave for the practical reasons that I just explained.
Yeah.
Most Italians don't leave until, as I said, until they like move in with their partner,
Right.
or they, you know, get married, or they decide to leave the city or the country.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on to the next one.
Yes.
In the European perspective, what is the experience of growing up in the melting pot of culture and people that is Europe?
Well, that's a very good question. You know, there are things that are problematic about that question when you talk about Italy, because, and especially in this particular moment in time and in history. I think the best thing about growing up, for example, thinking of my daughter or something, in a country like Italy where she's exposed to so many different cultural influences on the daily, and also she can, within a matter of hours, be in another country,
Sure.
is an exceptional gift.
Right.
Having said that, you know, I don't know, Italians, I don't know how young people would respond to this now, but for a long time, you know, getting back to the family, and, you know, in Italy, Italians, you know, you have family,
Sure.
then you have your extended community, so your town, then you have your region, then you have the country, and then you have Europe. So the average Italian, let's look at the average Florentine, they're going to say to you, first, I'm whatever, Giovanni Rossi.
Sure.
Okay, I'm going to give you my name. If they're from Florence, they'll probably even tell you which neighborhood they come from. Sono Fiorentino, I'm a Florentine.
Sure.
I'm a Tuscan, I'm an Italian, then I'm a European.
Okay.
So, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because there is, I think, something very important in preserving one's cultural identity.
Sure.
But there is a richness there. And so I think things like Brexit sent just a very negative message to a Europe that I think at that moment in time, for young people, that was sort of a badge of honor, you know, being a citizen of the EU, and something viewed with great pride. Because there is great pride in that. And I still think there is, for example, for young people, it's exceptional. There's the Erasmus program, so you can go study, you know, for example, in Spain or in Germany or in Holland, whatever. There's so many young people here from all over the world, all over Europe. And so I do think that proximity is definitely something that most young Italians and young Europeans appreciate. I just don't know right now with with the world going the way it is, what being European right now means
Sure.
to a lot of people, young and old. I look at it as an advantage, but I look at any kind of diversity as an advantage. But I find it interesting that the word melting pot is used. Europe is most definitely a melting pot, as is a city like Florence, for
Sure.
example. But, as U.S. citizens, I always think about the U.S. as
Right.
the melting pot, par excellence.
Right.
And I don't think we have that level of melting potedness here, if that's even a word. But it's getting there. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I feel it's very interesting because it's almost, I feel that in the U.S. it's almost flipped. Like you're American, like you know.
Right.
Like I being from St. Louis, Missouri, I have a lot of pride in St. Louis, but I would. It's just interesting. It's like almost flip flopped, Like
It is.
Yeah. Oh.
But it's strange here because Italians get nationalistic, for example, when they're watching soccer.
Right.
Or now that Yannick Sinner is one of the best tennis players in the world. Or if, Ferrari wins Formula One or something like that. But it's not like us. It's very different. And so, as I said, you have to kind of go back to that. First, I'm a, Florentine, then I'm a Tuscan, then I'm this, and then I'm a European. And I think for us, as, coming from the U.S., there is more this sense of, and I don't know actually right now how that feels, but most Americans are very proud to be Americans.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very interesting.
It's just a very different, and I think, for example, if you look at something like national pride, if you look at other European countries, for example, the French are always cited as being far more nationalistic than the Italians. And so a lot of it, I think, goes back to sort of the family, distrust of the government based on, just a lot of crazy history in this country post-World War II in terms of, how many governments it's had, the current government, and that's very problematic. We could talk about this for a long time. Next question.
Let's see here. So, at what point in your life did you know that you had to move to Italy permanently? Was there like a moment, or was it?
I guess there was, it was not a conscious decision. And I don't know that I'll stay here forever. I think about this all the time, right? Especially now that I'm at a point in my life where my daughter in 2 years is going to be going to college. She'll be an adult legally in a year, which is mind-blowing. And so I have started thinking about, again, like my possibilities. I don't think I ever made the conscious decision to stay here permanently. I think once I had a child here. Yeah, I mean... it was sort of just, at that point, it was like, you can't really leave, that would be like international kidnapping. So I think and that's why I actually tie the conversation to Jada becoming an adult in a year, because I always have kind of thought about, okay, well, once she's my family, right? And so she's here, and while she's here, I have to be here. I'm not going to... Jada, I'm not going to follow you to college, I promise. But I wouldn't exclude leaving or coming up with some kind of dream scenario where I could live part of my life here and part of my life somewhere else.
This sounds pretty amazing.
Right? And so that's the dream. I know people do it. I know it is doable. But I think I had a moment where I knew that this was where I wanted to be and where I needed to be. And I have had, and I'll be honest with our listeners, because I think it's important, and I talk about the reality, not the dream. There have been some really hard times here for me, especially being a working mom, basically alone, and raising a child in a foreign country has not been easy, and I am very vocal about that. And so, who knows? I think I made the decision. I don't like the word permanently, but... the life is really good here. And I think I've made a good life for myself here. But there are things I miss about the United States. And, if we want to get back to sort of like the beginning of the conversation, there are some even silly things that I miss that are just easier, or just the convenience. But at the same time, I've gotten so Italian now that I still feel like a fish out of water when I'm
Right.
there too. So that's why the ideal scenario
Sure.
would be
A little bit of this,
a little
yeah.
bit of this and a little bit of that.
Yeah, I feel that's why, I mean, I'm so grateful for this experience for many reasons, but it really is so important for, especially while you're young, to realize that there is more to the world than the United States. You know, I think that the United States does a lot of things really well, and I think they do a lot of things poorly,
Right.
and vice versa with Europe too. So
Right.
it's, you know, in the ideal world you could mash those that good together, but that's, you know.
Well, that's Canada, maybe.
Yeah.
Almost Canada,
Yeah.
maybe the Northern European countries.
Sure.
You know,
Yeah.
like Scandinavian countries. But I think all young U.S. students should spend time abroad,
I agree.
and
To some extent. I mean,
yeah, even a little bit of time.
Right.
Here I am going back to being the podcaster. I promise I'll let you ask me the rest of the questions.
Sure.
But now that you are coming upon the end of your time here, and I know it's going to take a while to process the whole experience, but you are somebody who is very observant, and I know you've been really actively engaging in these past few months here. And what do you think is, like, when I say to you, yes, I think every young student should spend some time
Sure.
abroad. Why? Like, what has been the most important thing that you've seen or learned even about yourself or about the world?
well, this is kind of obviously a very, very broad answer, or not broad answer, but it's a very broad question. So I could go on for hours about this, but I would just say that in America, there is such a drive to grow up so quick, and not that there's not that here, but you know, you're coming out of your sophomore year of college, and everybody expects you to have an internship.
Yeah.
And I think we kind of talked about this.
Yeah.
Obviously not on the podcast, but you said when you were in college, like, it was still fun. You know, you could go around and go be a server,
exactly.
Yeah.
You could get like a summer job, serving ice cream at the beach, and that
Right.
was okay. Nobody judged you.
Which sounds awesome.
Or
Yeah.
working
Yeah.
I worked in restaurants, and nobody judged. That was pretty normal.
Yeah. I just feel that in the U.S. everything is so fast-paced, which has its perks, has its pros and cons, but I feel like here you're just kind of allowed to be sometimes a little bit more. I feel you always have to be doing something in America with your life, or you can't just go travel around from country to country. It's just there's something different in the sense that everything's just a little more laid back, and everything's a little bit more experience driven. Lot less materialistic, I would say.
For sure.
I mean, America is
That's what we're known
materialism.
for.
I mean, that's how it goes. But yeah, just, having a good meal. The food alone speaks for itself. I think that is probably what I'm going to miss the most, is just the ability to,
It's really
you can't have a bad meal here.
it's really hard.
Everything's so affordable. Everything's, it's just, I would say the experience itself of, I wake up in the morning, I have class, I walk past Santa Croce, which is probably one of the most beautiful buildings I've ever seen in my entire life. Every day I get to do that. I take it so for granted at this point in my life. I can walk down the street, get the best dish of pasta I've ever had in my entire life for €12.
Mm-hmm.
Then, if it's a nice day, or even if it's a cloudy day, I walk 30 minutes up a hill to Michelangelo, Piazza de Michelangelo, see probably the best sunset I've ever seen in my entire life. It's just things like that no one really tells you about. You don't really think about it. You just think, oh, like, I'll do a couple months in Europe where I'm studying, see a lot of cool things. You don't really get it till you're here.
Yeah.
Like, I went, for example, I traveled a bit. I skied in the Swiss Alps for the first time in my entire life.
Wow, how did that feel?
I mean, I fell about 30 times, and I'm still not good at skiing, but even when you're coming up the ski lift, you just look to your left and you're just thinking, like, I'm looking at a postcard right now, but
Right.
I'm in real life.
But I'm living this, right?
Right.
I'm experiencing this. And these are all things you've established a relationship with this city.
Right.
You've established a routine.
Sure.
You have your places, you have your favorite things. You already know you're going to miss certain things. And so, and as I said, and once you get back, you're going to realize it even more. But I think you said something so fundamental, because what you focused on is the simple things, right? And it sounds banal, but it's not. It's not banal to be able to get a really good plate of pasta or to see that much beauty,
Right.
so much so that you walk by it so many times that you kind of don't even notice it
Right.
anymore.
Yeah.
So, now that you're coming upon the end of your time, my advice is take it
Right.
all in as much as you can, and keep those memories with you.
Sure.
Because those, I think, what, at least in my case, what happened when I studied here is that it planted all these seeds in me, this curiosity, this
Right.
desire to know more, to know the world, to really, get deeply involved in a country and in a culture and in a language.
Right.
And maybe it'll just be that, you'll just have a travel bug for the rest of your life, or maybe your journalism career will lead you to spend some time abroad. I hope so.
Yeah.
Because I do think it changes the way you see the world, the way you see yourself in the world,
Sure.
and the fact that the world is big. It's not just
It is very
America.
big. It is, yeah.
And it's hard for us to remember that, because we do have so much diversity in our
Sure.
country, because we do have such a huge country. I was reading an article this morning about how I believe they're just about to inaugurate the first high-speed train line between Vegas and LA.
I think I saw that too, yeah.
And it's such a big deal, right? And people are like, well, it took long enough. And it's like, guys, the distances in the US are crazy.
Right.
This is not a fast train from Rome to Florence.
Sure.
These are huge distances. So anyway, just keeping those things in perspective. In the United States, it's very easy to be very ethnocentric, because we can be very we're very isolating.
Sure.
And I think a lot of times a mistake that study abroad students make, even temporary visitors to the country, is thinking that they're just going to find some kind of version of the U.S.
Sure.
No, this is that's not why you don't come here to find the same convenience. You don't come here to find Starbucks, which unfortunately it's made it here. It took a long time, but it did arrive. You come here for exactly what you were talking about, to walk up to Piazzale Michelangelo,
Right.
to see that beauty, to savor it, to taste something so simple and realize that you'll be able to replicate that maybe when you go home, just a pasta with fresh tomatoes and basil. That's all you need, So sort of teaching us about, maybe as Americans, that it isn't so, speed, money, things. It's not what it's all about. It's about relationships, beauty, feeding ourselves, feeding our souls,
Right.
feeding our curiosity.
Yeah. And I will say the last thing I'll leave that question with is, I feel in America, especially the younger generation now, is so accustomed to being comfortable all the time. And I think the best thing you can ever do as a young person, no matter what age you are, is, I always say the best way to learn is jump in a pond where you don't know how to swim. So when you're placed in somewhere where you don't speak Italian, granted, Florence is a little bit different because a lot of people speak English, but it's so night and day. I think it's so important that everybody gets that experience at some point in their life, even if it's, moving from St. Louis, Missouri to New York or something like that. Just something where you're brought outside of your comfort zone and you have to figure it out.
Right.
But yeah.
I agree, 100%. Bravo.
Cool. All right, question 8.
Okay.
As an American, what is it like going back to the States after being here for so long?
It's so strange. So
Yeah.
there are certain things that I immediately fall back into, and I love.
Sure.
I love driving in the U.S.
Yeah, I cannot wait to drive.
Oh, it's compared to Italy, it's so relaxing.
I'm so excited to drive my car.
I am just blown away by how many times a day I'm in my car here and I'm dreaming about driving in the States.
Yeah.
Seriously. So that's one thing that when I go home, I'm always like, yes. And it's easy for me to go back to, for example, to New York City, because I always feel New York is just, it's the world,
Sure.
it's fine. I have a harder time I fall back into things pretty easily, but then I realize I've become Italian in a few ways. So, for example, the regularity of meals. It drives me nuts that I don't have regular meals when I'm in the States. For whatever reason, maybe it's just my family, I don't know. But Jada and I really suffer because I've been very Italian about that.
Sure.
Like, we have lunch, we have dinner. I'm kind of rigid about that. So that's hard for me, and I don't eat as well. And it's always a hard adjustment, even though I eat well.
Sure.
My family eats well. Like, I make concerted efforts to eat well. Sometimes you just don't eat well. You know, you have to go out or you have to get something quick.
Sure.
And I just don't feel as well. The wine costs too much in the States. This is a problem for me.
Yeah.
This is a problem
It's
when I go
expensive.
back to the States. And I like beer, but I try not to drink it, and I prefer wine. And so I go, and especially when you go to restaurants, you know, you see the price of something like a Prosecco or a wine that you know you get here at the supermarket for like €6. I can't do it. And so those things are hard. But I do feel sometimes like a fish out of water still. Like, yes, it's where I'm from, and yes, it's where I grew up, and I'm lucky. I have
Sure.
so many really close friends and family there still. I mean, my whole family is there. So I feel on the one hand, very home,
Sure.
you know, like I'm very much at home. But then I realize that I'm so changed, you know, and that there are certain things I just don't care about. You know, there are things like I'm not as up on pop culture as I'd like to be. I was watching the pictures from the Met Gala this morning. And I was like, oh, I don't know, like half of these people. So when I go home, I always also treat it like the first couple of days when I'm jet lagged and stuff, I like watching like morning shows, getting caught up,
Sure.
you know, and talking to people as much as possible. I love the openness of Americans. It's something I love. Like when I go to the US, you just chat with everybody. And so that's something I do miss because Florentines especially are much more reserved. You don't have those sort of like casual, like just silly conversations when you walk into a store or a restaurant.
Sure.
But yeah, I just always kind of feel a little off when I'm in the States, but at the same time, it's home. It's home, and there are things that I appreciate.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of things that I appreciate when I'm back in the States.
Yeah.
A lot.
Makes sense, for sure. Okay, this is our final question.
Oh,
To you, what is most important and To you, what is the most important and enjoyable aspect of Italian culture?
well, there are quite a few, and I think I would have to say probably the food. We're gonna go back to it, but
Sure.
it's not only the food; it's the ritual of eating.
Yeah, that makes sense for sure.
Does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
Like the fact that now it actually bothers me. Like, I'm not a to-go person. Okay, I don't like drinking or eating on
Sure.
the street. It's something you'll rarely see me doing. And it's something that years ago in Italy you would never see.
Right.
You would never see people walking around with a cup of coffee. And now it's something that you see. And something that I've always appreciated about the country is that there is this importance placed on moments of togetherness, of community, of family around a good meal,
Sure.
around a good coffee, a pastry, a really good glass of wine. So for me, those are the things. And if we want to go back to what we were just talking about a few minutes ago, it's finding the importance of those really basic, simple things,
Right.
but that make you feel like a human being.
Right.
You know, drinking a really good cup of coffee. It's really hard to get bad coffee here.
I was gonna say I feel like I've never had a bad cup of coffee here.
Right. It's hard. Like I'm
It is.
warning you. I'm giving you a heads up. It's gonna be hard to go back.
Yeah.
I have a hard time.
It's hard to find a good cup of coffee in the United States.
Yeah. And so I spend a lot of my time complaining when I'm in the US about, you know, getting a good coffee. And then, you know, just counting the days until, you know, I can get back to Italy and have a good coffee again. But it's the same, you know, with anything. So I think what I love most is that the beauty and the joy in things that I think we tend to take for granted in the US.
Yeah.
I'm not going to, if I drive through and I get my Starbucks and I spend all this money on basically just like a cup of, it just makes no sense. In Italy, you walk into a cafe, you stand up at the bar, you sort of engage minimally with the person there, or if you
Sure.
want to see and spend time with a friend, you go, you sit down. I like the joy of carving out moments in your life to spend time with someone, to really talk to them,
Yeah.
and maybe, ideally with a really nice drink, some really beautiful food, or even
Right.
just looking at something spectacular. I had a drink the other night with a friend in Piazza Santa Maria Novella. Just being able to sit in a piazza with a friend, have a drink, and just look at passersby, look at the beauty,
Right.
think about who walked here before you, and then you keep those things with you. And
Yeah.
so I think Italy has taught me that. I think that's what I love the most about living here is those moments that I can really spend with family, with friends, enjoying
Right.
my life, enjoying those moments. And I wish there were more. And then it goes back to your first question, which is about, the pace of things.
Right.
And a lot of us don't have time anymore,
Yeah.
even in this society. But fortunately, Italians are trying to, at least they're still trying to make time to make those rituals happen. So I would say that's probably what I appreciate most.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up the idea of a meal because I feel that's something that's definitely been lost in translation in America. I feel if you ask the majority of kids my age, if they grew up where, everybody gathered around the dinner table, somebody, mom, dad, somebody made dinner, and you sit there and eat a meal together. I was fortunate enough to where when I was a kid, we would do that probably 4 or 5 nights a week usually.
Okay, that's pretty
My
good.
mom was really good about it. My mom was a
Okay.
stay-at-home, thankfully, or I'm very grateful for that. She had plenty of time to spend with us. But yeah, I feel that in America, it's just, it kind of goes back to the fast-pacedness of America, but people don't eat together anymore. I mean, maybe they go out to dinner, but there's something about, mom making meatloaf and mashed potatoes and you're with all your siblings and I miss it a lot. And I'm grateful that I got that as a kid because a lot of people didn't.
Yeah.
But I think that's something that I really hope to instill if I'm lucky enough to have a family when I'm older, that I hope to instill in that. So, but yeah, that's something that I miss for sure.
And I think that's something that we can all take away from this culture, and it's not only something that, Italians are certainly not
Right.
the only ones that prioritize that, but it's something, as I was mentioning earlier, it's really conditioned the way I raised my daughter, and I wish I don't have the time to do a home-cooked meal every night. I wish I did. I really was better about it pre-pandemic, but I think that it is important to have that moment where you're saying, no, this is important to me. And, it's not just about, the food or, it's actually saying like, no, that we're sitting together.
Sure.
This is a sacred moment. We're slowing down and we're making this a priority. And I think that that's getting harder to do in general,
Yeah.
and I think if you can keep that and also take that sort of piece of Italy with you through your life, that's a good thing to take away from this experience, really putting people and good food at the center of your life. And it might not be every night. It might be, if you're lucky, it'll be 4 or 5 nights a week. Maybe it'll only be once a week.
Right.
But if it's absent, I think there are serious repercussions because those are the moments when you catch up and you
Right.
talk about what's going on and you laugh and maybe you argue or whatever.
Right.
But they are important moments for us to really reflect. And I think it's getting lost, unfortunately. So yeah, for me, absolutely, that'll probably always be my number one favorite thing about the country is the ritual around food and the importance of being at table with people you love.
Yeah.
Not a small thing.
Mm-mm.
So it looks like you have no more questions for me.
I am out of questions,
You're out of
unfortunately.
questions for me. It's been really nice having you as an intern. It's going to be hard. It's going to be hard for me to find another intern that's been so great. It's been a really nice few months having you here helping me with my guests, coming up with this great idea to answer questions live on the podcast. And so I want to thank you, and I want to thank our listeners, and I think that's it for now.
Well, you've been a great boss, and it's hard to leave a great boss. That's all I'm saying.
It's really been, I'm kind of sad. I don't want to get emotional, but it's been a really fun
That's been
internship.
fun. Yeah.
Grazie mille e grazie e alla prossima volta.
Ciao.